I'm Pat Morrison in the Los Angeles Times newsroom. After almost a year of recall electioneering, $250 million, it took maybe less than a half hour for the results to be counted. Not completely, but the projections have been made by the networks, by the Associated Press and the Los Angeles Times, that Gavin Newsom, by a 2-to-1 margin, it seems to be, is not going to be recalled. He will finish out his term as governor and he can run again in 2022. This is a quick turn of events. There may be flex in the numbers throughout the night as more in-person returns come, but the key precincts, the ones that show the way in every particular election, have been studied and scrutinized. And in this case, it looks like so far, Governor Newsom being kept in office with 66.7% of the vote. The vote to replace him, 33.3% of the vote. The governor issuing a statement saying that he was humbled and grateful, and in the spirit of his political hero, Robert F. Kennedy, he wanted to make this a more gentle world. Only half of the voters who cast ballots in this election seem to be choosing a replacement candidate. That's 4 million of the 8 million that have been counted. Larry Elder, the leading Republican, with 43% of the vote. Virtually the only Democrat on the ballot, Kevin Paffrath, is coming in second with 11% of the vote. And Caitlyn Jenner, who started with all that hoopla and ballyhoo, is 12th with 1% of the vote. Seema Mehta joins me, the LA Times political writer. Seema, hello.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
You're getting an earlier night than you might have thought.
It really is.
So what do these numbers tell you?
I mean, it shows the California electorate, which is incredibly Democratic, and which in polling showed, coming up towards the end of the election cycle, the polling showed that Democrats were sort of returning home, that they approved of the governor's handling of the pandemic, and that they were getting increasingly motivated to vote. When the governor felt under threat, when Democrats were really worried about this election, was midsummer, when the polling showed that while Democrats did approve of his performance, they weren't really that motivated to vote. But two things happened. The first one is that Larry Elder emerged as the Republican frontrunner as soon as he entered the race in mid-July. And that instantly gave Newsom the ability to have a one-on-one contrast, as opposed to before he was sort of painting it as this amorphous, like Republican recall. But with Elder has this decades-long history on conservative talk radio where he's made statements that you would make as a talk radio host, but that you might not make if you're thinking about running for office. Really controversial statements about women, about minorities, all kinds of things. And so that gave Newsom the ability to paint this as a one-on-one contrast. Like, if this recall is successful, this is the guy that's going to be the next governor of California. And I think that really scared a lot of Democrats. And also, yet another thing, which is Newsom had this enormous financial advantage. And they raised, the main anti-recall committee raised more than $70 million. In 4 weeks in August, they spent more than $36 million. And that was to turn out voters, especially voters who were crowded to the polls during non-presidential elections, young voters, Latino voters. And so I think that those two factors really helped the Newsom campaign from being a little bit nervous to feeling pretty confident coming into tonight.
Let me ask what you think of a couple of the statements Gavin Newsom said about tonight's vote. He said, "We said yes to science. We said yes to vaccines. We said yes to ending this pandemic. We said yes to people's right to vote without fear of significant voter suppression." And then he added, "Democracy is not a football. You don't throw it around. We may have defeated Trump, but Trumpism is not dead in this country. The big lie. It's a remarkable moment in our nation's history." So from that, what do you sense is going to be his path forward, both as a governor and as a candidate again, presumably in 2022?
Well, I think he's going to continue to do what he has been doing all along, which is, he is running some of the most liberal policy in the country, which is reflective of, the state's Democratic basing. Democrats outnumber Republicans in California by, something like 5 million voters. I'm sorry. And so I think, we're going to see the pandemic is, I think, really interesting. And I think it's going to not only shape the rest of his tenure, but it'll also impact races across the country next year in terms of the midterm races and some gubernatorial races, where Democrats see this, at least in California, as a winning message. The idea that, he did shut down the state, he did have mask mandates, vaccine mandates, that kind of thing, things that governors in states like Florida and Texas are really pushing back at so hard, that Newsom was able to make a positive case for why he needed to do that. And, when I was out talking to voters, especially I did a story about mothers and, who had to deal with, their kids' virtual schooling while they're trying to work. And they were frustrated at the situation. They weren't happy that their kids were home from school, but they also were really worried about, the safety of their children. And I think, that's the thing that came through, that even if Democrats weren't thrilled about how this impacted their lives, they did believe that Newsom was doing it because he thought it was in the best interest of, of the state's residents, of keeping them healthy, of not, keeping our infection rates and our death rates, lower than other places.
This may be a little inside baseball and a little early, but after the 2003 recall, there was talk of reforming the election process. So you didn't have 135 candidates on the ballot. Now we had something like 45 on the ballot. And the question about how many signatures are needed, how much money it would cost. Is there going to be any interest on the part of Democrats or, well, Republicans have not been happy with the threshold there is, but Democrats going forward, is there going to be any interest saying, look, we already won it, we don't need to change anything about it, let's move on?
I think before the first votes are cast, Democrats were already talking about how they believe that it was too easy to get to qualify a recall for the ballot. And if you look at California compared to the other states, the signature requirement here is less than other states. So some of the reforms that people have talked about are increasing the number of signatures you need to qualify it. Perhaps if a recall is successful, having the lieutenant governor step in instead of having a replacement candidate vote, or you having the recall election one day and then if it's successful, sometime down the road having an election of the replacement candidates. So there's a number of different things that people have talked about. They've also talked about limiting recalls only for criminal behavior or malfeasance, that kind of thing, not just if you don't like somebody's policy. The question is, the recall is, it's enshrined in California's constitution, so you can't just wave a magic wand and make it go away. So they'd have to go through either the legislature or signature gathering to place it on the ballot, and then voters would have to ultimately decide. And in the polling, voters are supportive of reforming the process. They don't want to get rid of it altogether, but they are supportive of various proposals to reform the process. But if you actually put it in front of voters, voters also don't like to give up their power. And so that I think there's a real question of whether they would. And then lastly, the last thing I heard, I was talking to a veteran Democratic strategist earlier today, who said, that he believes that it absolutely needs to be reformed. But he also wondered, he's also a little bit skeptical that that once today passed, that maybe people would just sort of move on to the next shiny thing.
Well, there are so many ways to put those questions before voters, like, do you want to give up power versus do you want to save $270 million in the middle of a pandemic? So we'll see the way that those questions get spun. And now there's always the future of the Republican Party in California to consider. It's suffered since Proposition 187 in 1994. And here again, an effort to gain a statewide office, which it hasn't held since 2006, has been defeated with kind of the lowest threshold possible to get a challenger, another candidate in through the recall process.
Right. I mean, this is the Republican Party's best chance, in more than a decade to get somebody elected statewide. And it shows that their power has fallen so dramatically in recent decades. I mean, there are pockets of strength. I mean, the fact that they were able to even get this on the ballot is, that was a rallying cry for a party that has been in some ways, disappointed about their power in the state. Additionally, the one thing I do think you can look forward to is that the party, a lot of the places where they made investments in terms of the recall, in terms of trying to get pro-recall voters out, where they put offices, where they hired staff, where they sent out paid mail. These were in the congressional districts that are going to be really, really competitive next year. And so they have sort of an advantage of starting months earlier with paid operations, organizing Republican voters in those districts.
So they start from a higher platform maybe than they were 6 months or a year ago just because of this recall election.
Right.
And what about Larry Elder, who had been reluctant to run, and now he's in it? He's got at least 43% of the people who did vote for a replacement for Gavin Newsom voting for Larry Elder, and now he's told a radio station today that he's not going away. Is he? And yet the Republican Party in California could not back him as their guy in this recall election.
Right. I mean, the party they played some games with the endorsement rules, and a lot of people believe that they were trying to have the fix in for former San Diego Mayor Kevin Faulconer, who's very much part of the establishment mode of the party. He's tight with Kevin McCarthy, and he's just tight with the members of the leadership of the party. But yeah, Larry Elder, certainly he emerges as almost the de facto face of the state Republican Party. He's probably the most prominent. I mean, he's not elected, but the most prominent Republican politician in the state at the moment, in addition to Kevin McCarthy, who I mentioned earlier. So he says that he's not going away. And if you look at how he did, the moment he entered this race, before he spent a dime on advertising, he became the front runner. He inspired passion among Republican voters that really none of the other candidates did. So it's hard to see. I mean, if he runs next year, it's hard to see who would be the Republican to topple him, because there aren't a lot of prominent Republican elected officials in this state. Kevin McCarthy's staying in Congress because he wants to be the next speaker. And, people really thought Kevin Faulconer, the former mayor of San Diego, who I mentioned earlier, that he potentially would, for years, actually, people have been writing that, if a Republican is going to get elected statewide, this is the type of guy to do it. who's a Republican, who's fiscally conservative, who's socially moderate. He had a history of working in a bipartisan manner in San Diego. He got elected by some Democrats, like Democrats crossed lines to vote for him. He worked with labor. He didn't have Trumpian rhetoric on issues like immigration. So people really thought that he was the style of Republican that might be able to appeal to NPP voters or maybe to some moderate Democrats. And he just completely flamed out in this race. I mean, it's really damaging for his future prospects.
But for the party itself, that sort of Republican has been roadkill for something like 20 years in California politics. They've been marginalized and sidelined by more and more conservative candidates who sweep the primary and then do badly, very badly in the general election. Is this a lesson that is still not learned or doesn't matter?
I would quibble with that a little bit, because I think if you look at 2010, Meg Whitman was more moderate than Steve Poizner. If you look at 2014, Neel Kashkari was more moderate than Tim Donnelly. If you look at 2016, John Cox was more moderate than Travis Allen. So I do think, but they were also, if you look at those three candidates, in each case, they also had the most money, and the people they were running against did not have anywhere close to the amount of money that they had. So it's whether it was the moderation or the financials, backing that led them to be the party's nominee each of those years. I think you could debate that. But yeah, I mean, it's as the party has grown smaller and as the number of NPP voters has gotten greater, and you can see this on the Democratic side as well, both parties have gotten more extreme and more more to the right or more to the left, because the moderates have left and sort of decided, like, we're not going to be a part of either one of you. And so, yeah, that does make it really hard, though, if you're a moderate Republican like Kevin Faulconer, to win the support of of a party that is is wholly backing President Trump.
Is Gavin Newsom going to look at this as a mandate, even if he doesn't use that word? And is he ill-advised to do so? I
mean, we don't know what the ultimate numbers are. So, and I think the gap will close a little as we get more, the voting that took place today in. But I think depending on what the level is, if he wins by like 20 points, I think, of course, he and his team are going to look at it as a mandate. But I do also wonder if there's going to be some sort of introspection about how they got to this point. I mean, this is such a Democratic state. They didn't take the recall seriously when it was first launched. They didn't fight the court order that gave the signature gatherers an extra 4 months to gather signatures, which is the only reason it's on the ballot. He went to French Laundry when he shouldn't have. He and then throughout this the last several months, I mean, there's other missteps that some people would argue that they've made. So I wonder if, not only for Newsom but for the Democratic Party, if there is just some introspection about, in a Democratic state, in a state that is so Democratic, how did we get to this point where our donors, or the Democratic donors, had to spend more than $70 million to make sure he got to hang on to his seat? That is money that could have been spent on House races next year. So I don't know if there'll be introspection, but I think there probably should be, because it's really remarkable that this whole thing even took place. I mean, this is not 2003. This is not the Schwarzenegger recall, because Newsom was more popular than Gray Davis. Arnold Schwarzenegger is like a singular figure in American politics, and the state was not as Democratic as it is today. So, I mean, I do think there are a lot of questions that should be asked about, what led to this.
So is this going to embolden the legislature to try to get Gavin Newsom further to the left with programs, policies, expenditures, and say, we've always wanted this, here's our big opportunity? Or is he going to be more of a Jerry Brown figure and assert himself and look for bigger long-term solutions that don't address district by district what particular assembly or state senate members may want? Is this an opportunity for him to go very, very big?
It is. I mean, I think he's going to face a lot of pressure, not only from the legislators, but from the donors. Like, CTA, the California Teachers Association gave a ton of money. The prison guards, I think, gave a bunch of money. Tribes gave a lot of money. And people don't give you millions of dollars for nothing. I mean, it's nice to say they give it to you because they believe in you. But, I mean, often there's an expectation that, you're going to take a second look at their policy that they favor. So I think he's going to face a lot of demands. And then he does have the opportunity. I mean, there are some, really start huge issues facing the state right now, whether it's homelessness, whether it's, wildfires. I mean, there's some major, water infrastructure. There are major things that the state is struggling with, and he does have the opportunity to try to focus in and bore in on these issues. It's sort of, I don't know what path he's going to take, but I think it'll be interesting to see how this affects him, whether he feels emboldened or whether he feels some humility.
For those of you political junkies who stocked up for a long night of numbers watching, maybe you can go to bed a little earlier tonight. As of this point, by 2-1, voters have rejected an effort to recall Governor Gavin Newsom. Larry Elder leads the pack of people, none of whom will become governor tonight or in the next few weeks, with more than 40% of the vote. Caitlyn Jenner's famous campaign fizzled at the end with about 1% of the vote. And the only identifiable Democrat on the ballot, Kevin Paffrath, ended up coming in second at this point with double digits, but the exact numbers, of course, to be determined. Seema, there are going to be so many ways of dividing this vote. We're going to look at it from an age demographic. You're going to look at it from geography, north, south, east, west, how ethnic votes split and changed along these lines too. So really, we've got what amounted to a very, very, very expensive focus group for each party.
Right. And I think for Democrats, they're particularly going to look at Latino voters and young voters. I mean, in the polling, we saw that they were less enthusiastic about turning out, and actually in the early vote by mail, we certainly saw that they were not turning out at the levels that they are in terms of voter registration. So I think that there is going to be some discussion. And when you talk to some Latino Democrats and groups that advise them, there is a feeling that among some Latino voters that you only come out for us for elections. Like, what else have you done for us? And so I think that that Latinos and young people are certainly going to be like a major focus of Democratic efforts. They already have it, but going forward.
Talking about reform for the recall process, Kurt Bardella, who was on the staff of Darrell Issa, who was a Republican congressman from the San Diego area, has just tweeted, "New rule, if you force a recall and lose, you should have to reimburse the taxpayers the cost of it." So there, when we're talking about reforming the recall, there's an effort that I think a lot of voters would want to get behind.
I mean, I think the cost of it is a major, major issue. I mean, so the estimates ranged all over the place from $276 million to $400 million. It's a lot of money.
The vote is not even close. At this point, we have a 2-to-1 margin. Governor Gavin Newsom avoiding recall in the state of California. Californians turned in nearly 10 million ballots by the time the polls had closed tonight. That was up from roughly 44% of the entire electorate. And of that, about half were Democrats, a quarter were Republicans, and a quarter were declined to state, which, as we know, Seema, now declined to state has more registrations than Republicans do in the state of California.
And it'll be really interesting to see how NPPs ended up voting this time around, because typically they tend to mirror, the rest of the state. They usually they're more like roughly 2/3 Democratic, 1/3 Republican. But there is some question about whether they favored the recall more than Democrats did. So I think that's going to be one of the really interesting things to delve into once we get the breakdown of the results.
And for the people watching from afar, from Washington, from New York, the national pundits who are watching California as a bellwether state, not for Republicans, but certainly for how Republicans should conduct winning campaigns, how not to conduct losing campaigns. And for Democrats, we're thinking, California, really blue state, but maybe there's some strategies out of this recall that I can use myself.
Well, I mean, I think, Larry Elder is just an interesting candidate to look at. I mean, he is very much like President Trump. And so it's like, there are times when that persona, that big media persona that has made really controversial statements, who's unabashed about what he believes, there's times when that's successful, which was in 2016 in the presidential contest. There are times when it's not successful, which is what this recall is. So I think that's one of the things that, is the future of the Republican Party going to, be sort of these larger than life media figures who have sort of colorful histories, or is it going to revert to form where it's more, going back to like the Jeb Bushes of the world? And I think that's one of the things that'll be really interesting to see in the upcoming presidential contest in a couple of years. And then in terms of strategy, I think, the only thing I think of in terms of the Republican strategy is really those congressional districts, the way that their party used this recall as a way to start early organizing for these hot midterm races next year.
And you've also got a drift, if you want to call it a continental drift, as the conservative states get more conservative, the liberal states get more liberal, and what that bodes for, as we have seen with the electoral count, national politics, electoral politics, and really some kind of comedy in getting things accomplished in the face of climate change, in the face of the COVID pandemic, which seems to come back at us again and again in cycles. And whether or not any of these political moves are addressing those issues, willing to address the issues, or more willing, in fact, to create division rather than solution.
Right. And I think you saw this when you saw Newsom speak earlier tonight. He was, I think, a little bit more emotional than he usually is when he speaks. When he was talking about sort of what kind of future are we handing today's kids, he has 4 kids. He just seemed a little bit caught in the moment about what is this, with all this fighting, with all this nastiness, with people questioning the integrity of our elections. What kind of future are we handing today's children? And so I do think that's it's a very interesting question. And I also think one of the things he was referring to, which was the big lie, the idea that elections are rigged, that if you don't win, the automatic answer is, oh, somebody must have cheated, not that you ran a poor campaign or there weren't enough votes for you. That is something I think we're going to really see going forward, because it seems like it's been the answer from certain members of one party for several elections now.
Seema, what are you going to be looking for as all the numbers finally come out, and what should our readers be looking for?
I'm really interested to see what the final margin is, and to see what the vote was on the day of today, election day, because voting patterns in this country have just completely flipped. Back in the day, a couple cycles, not so long ago, Republicans voted early and Democrats waited to vote on election day. And with President Trump undermining people's faith in mail ballots and elections in general, now you have Democrats really voting early and you have Republicans really voting on election day. So I am intrigued to see what the numbers are in terms of the final margin, because I think for the final margin, that also dictates how much does Newsom view this as a mandate, or is he damaged? I mean, if he wins by 10, that's not so great considering he won by more than 20 in 2018. So the final margin, and then also voting Tuesday, September 14th in person, what that electorate looked like.
Seema, thank you very much. Seema Mehta, LA Times political writer. A rare early night for political writers. We usually never get to sleep before at least midnight on election night. Tonight is a rare exception. East Coast pundits, you're welcome. This is our gift to you from California. So Seema, have a good night's sleep. We're going to read all about her analysis tomorrow on the LA Times website and in the newspaper. Thank you again, Seema. And of course, the numbers. You'll want to know the numbers. For those, you can go to the LA Times website. It'll refresh those numbers, and it will also list in descending order the candidates on the recall ballot, those 40-some names, the order of the numbers of votes and the percentage of votes that they have received. So far, Larry Elder is at the top of the heap, but maybe you've got a particular candidate you are following, whose fate you want to find out, whose numbers you want to see. You will find it all there on the LA Times website. We want to thank you for joining us throughout the evening as we brought to you all of our experts, all of the wisdom that the LA Times has fielded over these months of the recall election campaign, the signature gathering, and all of that will be brought to bear for you tomorrow, too, to read as they are frantically typing their analyses and their insights even now. So go to the LA Times website tonight and tomorrow for all of that. I'm Pat Morrison in the LA Times newsroom, and on behalf of all the crew working, you can't see unless we turn the cameras around, I want to thank you for being here.